So the Adobe Target Node Client NPM package is what we're going to use to implement this server side. Like I mentioned previously, it essentially does a lot of the heavy lifting for us. Although the documentation says that it's super simple to use, which it is, the documentation gets a little bit confusing because it starts with a simple example of a target-only implementation, then adds the Marketing Cloud ID integration, then I think the Customer ID integration, the Analytics integration, and then it gives you the whole kind of shebang at the end, including the hybrid testing snippet, which allows server-side testing to speak to client-side testing and create a unified visitor. But what I figured that would be easiest is just to copy the most complex example of this, set up a simple app and work it through, not necessarily top to bottom, but work it through in a logical manner in terms of how this would run on a route when a request is made to the server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just quickly copy this into Atom, which is my text editor of choice. I'm just on the other screen. Hold on one second. I'll just open up. I've created a folder on my desktop called Target Server 2. The reason it's 2 is because I've already got Target Server 1, which is what I used to learn this originally. So I'll just create a new file. I'll just call it target-server.js. Now this is just my my main file, the equivalent of an app.js that you'd normally have. We'll just copy that in and save it. It won't work at the minute because it doesn't have any of its dependencies, Express, Cookie Parser, or the Adobe Target Node Client installed. So let's do that. So let's use the terminal quickly. Let's copy the full path. Use the terminal, navigate to that path and install the dependencies. CD, and then we will npm init. So we'll initialize the node package manager. Just accept whatever it gives us. So that's there. So that'll give us a package.json, which is here. First thing we need to add to this package.json file is a script to allow us to run our server when we come to do it. Now it's pretty simple to do, you can do it in many ways, but the way I'm going to do it is just set up a simple script just to do that. Give me 1 second, and it should be node, and then it's just the name of the file that's the main JS file. So that should be that. Yeah, that should work. Now this still won't work because we have dependencies here, which is Express, Cookie Parser, and the Node Client for Target that we haven't installed. So let's quickly install those. So it would be just npm install Express. Now this is kind of relying on you guys having some knowledge of Express and Node.js and backend languages. Now, everything I cover here actually is cross-transferable to more or less every language, providing you know that language kind of thoroughly. And if you're a marketing manager who is just trying to get an understanding of what is server-side, how does it work, what are the advantages and disadvantages, and to be able to have a top-level conversation with a developer, then this should still be fine. I hopefully can keep it top-level enough. So now we've got our run script, we've got all of our dependencies installed. Now, at this point, you'd think this would work, and it should work if we hit npm run and then the script. Now what you see here is a syntax error, and it says that, I can just find the syntax error. Here you are. So essentially there is an error, a syntax error on line 87. Now this syntax error is an error in the npm documentation, so they need to change it. So don't be caught out by this. So on line 84, I believe, is it 84? 87. Yeah, on line 87, you have this closing brace. You actually don't need it. They've put an additional one in there, so I would just end this here and then save it. At this point, again, you'd think this would run, but it doesn't. It errors, and then it says organization ID is undefined. Now, the reason this happens is because with newer JavaScript syntax, template literals and interpolation use this syntax. This is also the syntax that's used by Target to put in variables, and because of that, it errors. So don't be caught out by this like I was for a long time. Just delete all the dollar signs, because what it's doing is essentially in this template, it's trying to replace the values of these interpolated organization IDs, visitor state, and content. And it can't do that because, well, it's trying to interpolate, and then when it tries to look for them in this template.replace, it doesn't work. So just get rid of those. And then in theory now, eventually, once you've got those gotchas out the way, your server will run. So if we just go to localhost 3000 quickly, now you'll notice here that the actual root is /AB test. So if we just go to the root, it won't bring anything back. So if we go to /AB test, you'll get this response. Now this response doesn't mean anything, but if you look in the terminal, you'll notice it started to print something out. It's printed an object, which we can start to look at. Now, the object it's printing out is actually the request object down here. If you see this console.log request. Now, at this point, it's probably worth doing a bit of a rundown of what's happening here. Now, the top of the file, pretty self-explanatory. Really, it's importing Express, which is the Node framework that we're using to set up this simple server, and is letting us host it. Then cookie parser, so cookie parser is letting us read the cookies that are set and do things to them. Then you've got the Target Node Client, which is the NPM package that's doing most of the heavy lifting. This config here needs to be adjusted to have your client and org ID in there. I'm going to quickly paste mine in. I've already shown earlier on how you get the client ID. The organization ID can be retrieved pretty easily. If you just go to your main marketing.adobe, it'll have it in there at the bottom. So it's just a simple case of pasting these in. Okay, save. So that's the config, and the config is used by the Target Node Client later on. This is just a basic template, which is just some a couple of scripts and a little bit of HTML. Well, actually, it's just one p tag. Then Express is called. Then client is set to a Target Node Client.create, and it's using the config to create an instance of the Target Node Client. Cookie parser is called, so we can use cookie parser to parse cookies, obviously. Then we set up the app.use express static. So this is where the static files live. So if I just create a new folder and call it public for demonstration purposes. So this is now where, for example, up here when we've got at.js and we've got measurement.js, this is where it will look for those files. They're currently not in there. We'll paste them in there a bit later on. It is worth noting that you're probably going to be using launch or DTM to implement at least some of these, Visitor API, for example, or at.js. So how you do this in a real-world app is marginally different, and I'll demonstrate that later. Then there's a couple of functions. There's a function here that's a save cookie. So basically, it takes in the response and the cookie. And if the cookie doesn't exist, it returns. If the cookie does exist, it creates a cookie, which is the cookie that Target uses to essentially assign an experience and to be able to identify a visitor. Then there's this const result. So basically all this is doing is taking the template up here that we've got, and it's replacing three things. It's replacing org ID, visitor state, and content. Then you've got these save cookie functions, which inits these functions up here, and these all live inside this send success response. So later on we'll see this send success response, but again takes in response, res and response. It sets headers. It replaces the content in the template with the three variables we need here. It saves the cookies that we need, that Target needs. Then it basically sends a 200, which is an OK response to the server, and then just shows the result. Again, this is not how you do it in a real world situation, but it works well for this demo. And then you've got an error function. So if anything goes wrong, it's passed off to this error function that sends a 500 response from the server. This app.get here, so this is what happens. So when we go to the server, we go to this route, which is /AB test. This initiates the whole thing. So it uses the Target Node Client to set the name of the visitor cookie, then the actual visitor cookie itself, then the target cookie name, and the target cookie. So this is it just building up the cookies it needs. Then it creates this variable, which is a payload, and now the payload needs at least one inbox, and as you've seen earlier on, my inbox is called server_test_1, which is what I created over here essentially originally in my target interface. Now it needs an index, so you can identify it later on. Now you could put many in here. You could put several inboxes and it would return several bits of content, but for the purpose of this we'll do one. Then it goes off and creates a request. Now the request is just an object that has the payload, which is this. It has the target cookie, which is what's been creating up here, the visitor cookie, and it has this target location hint cookie. Now forget about this for now because we'll cover it off later. But it's what's used for hybrid testing to show target client side that there is a server side tests running. Then it logs a request. Then it has a promise here that once this function is initiated, this client.get offers, which we talked about earlier, which is part of this Node SDK, it initiates this send success response, which is what we talked to earlier on, where it sets headers, replaces the content, and then shows the content to the page. Or if there's an error, it sends the error function, which is up here, which we also talked about. And then the final thing here is just the app.listen. So this is just the server that is set up on port 3000 on my local machine. And that's how it works top to bottom. Now, the first time you run through this, it doesn't make much sense because it's very complicated. And there's things that go on here that I don't fully understand. That I think unless you actually worked for Adobe and you created this NPM package, you wouldn't. But as long as you have enough of a understanding on what's going on, it allows you to manipulate and get to where you need to be. So I'm going to save this now. I've put in this server test 1 here, and I've put in my client code. Just going to go to my terminal. I'm going to end the server and restart the server. Then I'm going to reload it. And what you'll see, what it returns is an object. Forget about the object for now. But if we inspect this, you'll see that in the head and in the first script, this visitor.get instance is now fired, and it's fired with the org ID, which I've set in my config, and it's populated server state with an SDID here, the supplementary data ID. Now, this is important because this is what is used to create a single visitor server side to client side, which inevitably without this should have no reporting. So it's very, very important. But what we can see here is that this is initiated up here, and this visitor.get instance has been called, and these things here have been replaced with org ID, which is from here, and the server state, which actually is from inside the object. So you'll see here that it populates it with config, sorry, not config, so config.id is the org ID, but visitor state is json.stringify, so it's turning a JSON into a string, response.visitor state. So if we just take a look at the response, things become a bit clearer. If we just get rid of that, and just here, before it does any of its replacement, we just actually look at the response object, and I just jump back to my terminal, rerun. What have I broken? Unexpected token. Put that in the wrong place. I won't put it inside a variable because that would be very stupid. This runs again. Just fire this quickly. Now in the console now, or in the terminal, you'll see the object that's a response, which is being returned from the Adobe Target server. So you'll see this visitor state is an object, and this is the object that is being inserted into this server state object here. So it's replacing it. But also, what you'll see here is you've got lots of things. You've got visitor state, target cookie, mbox, blah blah blah, session, whatever it may be. But you've also got these mbox responses, and these mbox responses are important because this is where your content lives. So to save time, I'm not going to jump into mbox content and then mbox responses, and then I'm just going to jump right into the final output of this. But if you basically drill down to that object a bit more, eventually you'll come to an array, and that array contains the content from the mbox. So if we just look at this, and rather than it be response.content, because that's at the minute is an object, if we do response.content dot and then mbox responses, I think is, and then you see earlier on we looked at the we set a ID down here, which was index ID 0, which is this sits at the 0 position in the array. So now we've set content to response.content.mbox responses 0.content. Now this is just drilling down into this, right? Inside mbox responses, you've got content, mbox responses, an array. The first item in the array is our first mbox, and inside that is another object called content. You've got to take my word for it. But if we now save this and we start our server again, what you'll see now is London-based Adobe Target Conversion Optimization Agency. So this is now returned content from the server. So it's now connected to the target server, and the target server has responded. That's what I wanted to see. Sorry, it was cached. The target server, then that's returned the content from this, and then that content has been rendered on the page, which is perfect. So that's kind of the top and bottom of it for actually getting content back. This at the moment will not fire any requests. So the reason it won't fire any requests or anything is because it doesn't actually have the app measurement code or the target code or the audience manager code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly just put them in here. So they have to go in this public folder. Well, depends how you set up your Express application, but my static folder is directory name plus public. So I already have all these downloaded. from earlier on. You can get them from inside your Adobe account, or just Google it if you don't know where to find them. But I'm just going to paste these in here quickly. Paste. So now I've put an app measurement, AT.js, and the visitor API service. Because obviously there is no launch or DTM on here, so there is nothing to fire. So now visitor API.js it was sending an error previously, and see here the S is not defined. There's no visitor API service. It's because they weren't there. Now I've put them in there, so now everything in theory should fire. So let's just end the server, because the most difficult thing with this to wrap your head around is just clear this. Now look if we've got any requests. So now you'll see we've got requests. So now analytics is firing because we've obviously put it on there. Target is firing, and the Experience Cloud ID service is firing because we've got the visitor API. But what is key to look at here is the supplementary data ID. So this value here, in order to confirm you set this up right, needs to be consistent across Target. So this one ends in A16. Analytics, this one ends in A16. And then inside here, when we look at our get instance, you'll see that the supplementary data ID that's being set is also A16. Now what that means is that what's happening here, and let me just quickly talk through it, is if we're looking at app measurement, I've added this in here, which basically, and you need to do this, unless it will not work, it just sets the account, which in my case is just my dev environment for my agency website, and it sets the V as basically s_gr, which is basically just a new instance. So what the get visitor.get instance does is one of two things. It either picks up the visitor object that's already been created, or it creates a new one. So in this case, what we're wanting it to do is not create a new one, because one already exists server side. So it reads the cookie that we've set from down here, and it then connects that visitor server side to that visitor client side, which means everything they go on to do now is one visit. So if you have A for T set up, for example, and the end goal of this isn't just this page, the end goal is actually a conversion 5 pages away from here, you'll be able to track it through, and you don't create 2 visitors, because ultimately you'd have no data. Essentially 2 visitors, one server side and one client side, which would not be ideal. But that's kind of it for how it works in this kind of example. Like I said, real world scenario, it doesn't necessarily work like this. A lot of the concepts are the same, but you have things like launch, and you don't have a template just sitting in a template literal like this. So I'm going to end this video, and then I'm going to jump into an actual real world example.